Now, in your guys' Google Drive, you can see this FAR section doc. That's what we're going to be using today. So if you guys want to open this up and go along with me, or you can just go off of my screen. We can stay together here. So just like anything that the government does, they set aside rules and guidelines for it, and that's what these FAA FARs are, is Federal Aviation Regulations. So the FAA stands for Federal Aviation Administration. And you can pull up, I'll show you guys real quick. You guys can pull up hold on just 1 second. All right, sorry about that, guys. Anyways, you guys can go on at any time if you really want to see the entire regulation book. It's all published online. So the FAA regulations here, you just do a Google search for that, click on that, and you can click on that look up FARs, and this will give you every FAR that's used. So the title of the section is the Title 14, talks about aeronautics and space, and then you guys can go through the 1,400 different definitions or requirements that they have. So feel free to look at that. You can also buy the book of FARs if you're really interested. But some of the basic things that I want to talk about first are, let me pull this up really quick. Is some of the definitions that you guys need to know. Let's see. We can pull it up in here. So Title 14, Chapter 1, Subpart A. This 1.1 is our definitions and abbreviations. And in the aviation world, we use thousands and thousands and thousands of abbreviations. It's kind of out of control, but it's just the way it is. It's the way aviation has been ran for a long time. So you can go into this definitions area, and you can look at all these different definitions if there's something that you don't understand. So this is kind of important, just to kind of get you guys up to speed if you don't have very much aviation background. This will help with those questions you have. I just posted the link in the chat there. But this will just kind of help with your studies. I would use this alongside your studies to in order to maybe clear up some of the questions you might have as far as definitions. So some of the really important ones that I really want you guys to know, and some of them we're just going to learn along the way, but I need you guys to memorize, most importantly, ceilings. This is something that we use on a daily basis in dispatch. So the FAA's definition, full definition, is right here. What I need you guys to write down and make sure that you memorize is basically that a ceiling is the height above the Earth's surface of the lowest layer of clouds that is reported as broken, overcast, and it says obscuration, not classified as thin or partial, but the way you guys are going to see it is it's known as vertical visibility. So broken, overcast, or vertical visibility. That's an extremely important definition, and as we go into this, we'll talk about why that's important. But there's several abbreviations that we use that on a daily basis as well. So make sure that you guys know this ceiling. And I can go over that again if you guys want me to reword that again. I can do that, but make sure that you're writing that down. So remember that this is Title 14, Chapter 1, and then Subpart A. And as it says here, 1.1, the abbreviations are in 1.2, but this is where you're going to find a lot of the abbreviations that we use. So things like AGL means above ground level. That's a good question, Elizabeth. We'll get into that just a little bit later, but yeah, flight releases are what we do as dispatchers, but let's go over some of this stuff real quick. So AGL, above ground level, ALS, approach light system, APU, auxiliary power unit. All of these things you're going to hear me rattle off, and sometimes I don't know if you don't understand what an APU is, or I try to catch myself, and it's something that I work on, but sometimes I'm just blurbing out acronyms because that's the way we talk at work, and that's the way we talk in the aviation field. So just know that there is a reference for you guys to go to. If you guys get neck deep in abbreviations, you guys know where to go to find the definition of those abbreviations. Some of these are really important. Some of them I've never seen myself. And I actually frequently, a lot of us dispatchers even still will use this to look up what certain things mean because we're not clear ourselves. You'll see something on a report and you turn back to this to get a little bit of information as to what does that mean, but yeah, just know that 1.1 and 1.2 are really going to be your friends. But yeah, just keep all of that in mind. Really, the most important definition that I want to hit right now is that ceiling, because of legalities of how we dispatch. Now, Elizabeth brought up a really good point, and maybe this is something that we should kind of start off with. But we can go in here. Let's see. Let's see if this flight, yep. So this is what a dispatch release looks like, and this is just kind of a gee golly right now. A lot of this is just going to be complete gibberish to a lot of you, but this is what the flight plan that we create. This is what it looks like when we send it to the to operations or the gate to the airport, basically, as they're preparing for the flight. This is what the captain gets from us and everything. So yeah, this gives us our flight number, the date, the city pair, the tail number. You can see that it's a dispatch release. You can see the dispatcher's name there. You can see the amount of fuel he planned for, the runways that he planned for, and the flap settings, the temperatures. And then this is what air traffic control gets. We call this the ATC strip. And this gives them a lot of information about the entire flight. Believe it or not, this contains a ton of information about what the aircraft is capable of, what time we're planning on starting our flight, what time we're supposed to complete our flight, what type of equipment we plan to use, and then the route that we plan to fly on. So each one of these characters identifies a piece of equipment on the aircraft, as well as this. So a lot of information, and as you can see, it's extremely shorthanded. They don't have enough space to type out this aircraft is GPS equipped. It's also got PBN. It's got ACARS with a printer, ACARS PDC. It's got all this other stuff. They don't have enough room for that on the strip, so they just give it a character, and you just got to know what it means. So, but this was flown by a CRJ 200. And then here's all of our fuel information. So, like I said, acronyms: release fuel, minimum takeoff fuel. So this is what they have to have on board when they take off. Taxi out, the amount of fuel we plan for them to taxi out to the runway from the gate. This is how much fuel we plan for them to burn en route. If there was an alternate planned, there would be fuel there: reserve fuel, hold fuel, contingency fuel, landing fuel. This is what they're supposed to have on board when they land at the airport. And then how much fuel we plan for them to taxi in with. So this is all weights for the aircraft, this side, where it says weights here. This is the basic operating weight, and the index. So the fuel is in here. We can see it in time. The fuel here is in pounds. And as dispatchers, we always talk about pounds. We always talk about how many pounds of fuel the aircraft has on board. We don't use gallons or anything like that, because then it just gets even more confusing. We can transfer directly pounds to time, and have a good understanding of how much fuel, we plan to burn over a certain point, just using pounds and time. So, pilots, I don't know, Rex, you probably used all the old sectional charts and TAC charts and en route charts and stuff like that when you were flying.
Yes.
Yeah. So now everything's gone to this EFB. EFB is an electronic flight bag. So basically they have one of those Surface tablets, and it's got every chart. It can flight follow. It can actually see where they are in the air and stuff like that. So it has all the equipment lists and stuff like that. So yeah.
All of this information that is being shown on the right side of the weights, that's all defaulted into the computer by aircraft, is it not? I mean, other than the payload, etc.
I'm sorry, I missed part of that.
The where the fuel weight is, and then the aircraft information. Those numbers on the right-hand side there, the payload, etc. Those are all defaulted by the computer, are they not?
Yeah. So we actually. Let me make my mouse just a little bit bigger because I know my last class had issues seeing what I was trying to point to. So let me do that really quick just to help. See if I can remember how to do it. There we go. That'll just make it easier for you guys to see what I'm talking about. Because I tend to use my mouse since I can't. I don't know. I talk like an Italian. I have to use my hands when I talk. So I'm sitting here like using my hands while I'm talking to my computer. But for you guys to see, I use the mouse. So, but yeah, so what happens is we'll put input data into the computer. When we look at this booked passengers, that's how many passengers we've expected for the flight. And so when we talk about the bow, this is something that our maintenance department will actually, this is a number, and then this index number, the 46.4, we'll get to this a little bit later, but that's the center of gravity. So that number indicates how many inches from the center of gravity, or the center of the aircraft, the weight is distributed. So it's a little front heavy. Does that make sense? From where the center of the aircraft is. So maintenance every couple of months has to take the aircraft into the hangar. They take off all the fuel. They keep the oil on board, the necessary oil. They put a crew on board, and then they weigh the aircraft. So everything that's essential to operate the flight minus the fuel, as far as they put a captain and a first officer and however many flight attendants, they put that weight on there, and then they weigh the aircraft and figure out where the true center of gravity is on the aircraft. And that's this basic operating weight. This is the number that doesn't change. I know the captains and stuff are a little bit different weights or things like that, but this gives them a very good idea of about what it'll be. Does that make sense? The planned payload is how much the passengers and the bags will weigh. This max payload is what what can we put on the aircraft and still stay within our center of gravity and everything like that. So the zero fuel weight is the weight of everybody on board the aircraft, but no fuel on the aircraft. This planned takeoff weight, this is fueled up, sitting on the ramp, ready to go. So this is completely ready for flight. And then this is this planned landing weight. This is what the plane should weigh when it touches down on the ground at its destination. So this max cargo, this is this is a little bit, so the captain, we don't necessarily plan what's getting put into the cargo bays as dispatchers. The captain actually puts those numbers in, and he'll actually run his takeoff data, and that's why we have this max payload weight. This is the weight after everything's on the airplane, like as far as bags and passengers. This is kind of the limit that they have. So yeah, the planned payload is just the passengers, the passengers and expected weight of baggage, and this is the max they can operate with. So, and then this gives us the seating configuration. So there's 50 people booked on this flight. There's 50 seats on this aircraft, so it was a full flight. So that's what all these weights mean. And as we get a little further along in the course, a lot of these weights, you'll see why we calculate them, why they're important. But does that answer your question? So that's kind of a rundown of these weights, and this release fuel, just to kind of hit that, release fuel is the amount of fuel after we add all this up. That's how much fuel after we add up the different amounts of fuel. This starting with the taxi out. So the taxi out, the burn off, the alternate, reserve, hold, contingency, and when you add all 5 of those numbers up, that equals this number. This number. So but with this EFB, so the electronic flight bag is what EFB stands for. Like I said, everything's on a tablet now. And so they are actually required, just like fuel, they have to have a certain amount of battery life to operate the flight. If they don't have this battery life, they literally have to call us and say, my EFB isn't charged to that amount, 1 hour and 32 minutes. And they have to delay the flight until that battery has that much time on it before they can even take off. So, because we don't carry any paper charts on board the aircraft anymore. So, yeah, that's what that EFB is. This gives us our average winds that we plan for. So during the climb, we plan for a 3-knot tailwind. During cruise, we plan for a 10-knot headwind, descent 10-knot headwind. And these are just average numbers. So ISA deviation, this is the deviation from our standard temperature that we plan for. So when we talk about temperature, we'll also talk about when we get into weather, we'll talk about this ISA deviation a little bit more. But basically what happens is the higher in elevation or the hotter the air is will affect the performance of the aircraft. So we actually have to run what the temperature is. We've got a plan for that deviation from the standard temperature. in order for us to know how the engine's going to perform. So we'll go over that once again when we get into weather, and then also in flight planning we use this a lot. So that information a lot. So and then this is our wind speed and direction. So this is what we plan over the route of the flight. This is where we plan the winds to what we're planning them to be doing. So as for these two parts here, these are called METARs and TAFs. So when we talk about these FARs, and the reason why I need you guys to understand the definition of a ceiling, why that's so important, is to determine the legality of the flight. So when we're looking at weather, there's certain criteria that we have to meet in order to even operate the flight. This is why you'll see flights get delayed or canceled. It's all weather related or maintenance related. It's not because we hate our passengers. It's not, all this doomsday stuff that people think, oh, well, Alaska's just screwing us here or Delta's just screwing us here. No, there's a safety reason why flights get delayed or canceled. And probably 9 times out of 10, it's going to be something to do with the weather. And with the weather will determine performance. It'll determine, the length of usable runway that we can use. The FAA's set up parameters for every aspect of the flight and says you have to meet this criteria. And if you can't meet this criteria when you're planning the flight, then you cannot operate the flight until it is safe, until it's above this criteria. So this first part, we call this a METAR. This is talking about current weather. This tells us the time that the report was generated, tells us what the winds are doing here, the visibility, the sky condition, the temperature and dew point spread, and then the altimeter. And once again, when we get to weather, we'll really drill this in and help you guys understand how to decode this. But this temperature and dew point, and then also this altimeter setting, is going to have a lot to do with the performance of the aircraft. And then the visibility and our ceilings, the sky condition, that's going to determine our legality. So, and the same with the TAF. So the TAF is a forecast of what we expect the weather to do over a period of time. So this gives us, once again, a timestamp on this side, and then it tells us what we expect the winds to do, the sky condition, or the visibility and the sky conditions. So your job as a dispatcher is one of the biggest things, like I said, is going to be the ceiling, and knowing whether or not the ceiling and the visibility, those are going to determine whether you're legal to go. They're going to determine, do I need an alternate airport listed on the release? Things of that nature. So this is just information about the aircraft or about, different things that the pilots may need to know. This is just kind of information for the pilot, just saying, hey, this is what's up. Then we get down here, and this is the actual flight plan that we file. So you guys saw up here in this ATC strip, this section here is the IFR flight plan. So this is telling the air traffic controller the route that we're planning on flying. Well, down here you can see that same information here. This is the route of flight. And we can see those broken up into smaller legs so that they know what's going to be happening at those points. We can see the St. George Airport. We can see the amount of distance that was flown right here. We can see our latitude and longitude, the flight level we're expected to be at, what the winds are doing, things of that nature. We're going to look at times over here, things like that. So, yeah, that's your guys' introduction to a flight release. Down here at the bottom, this is all performance information for the pilot. So this tells him basically, if there's any changes that he makes last minute, say they threw on, or rather than landing one direction, all of a sudden they decide to land another direction, and determining whether or not they have a tailwind or a headwind from what they were planned at, they can figure out what the deviation is that they have to make into those takeoff numbers or landing. So that's what that section is. And then this last part is your NOTAM package. So this is telling the pilot, what's operating at the airport. Say a runway light goes out, or a taxi light goes out, or navigational equipment goes out. This section down here at the bottom actually tells them what equipment is going out, what can they rely on. So, yeah, that's a rundown of a flight release. So, you guys have any questions about any of that? So, yeah, let's jump back over here to the FARs. So we went over where to find the general definitions and the general. Oh, sorry. Yeah, feel free to unmute your mic and interrupt me. Sorry about that. How much of it's generated automatically? I'll jump back on there really quick and. Oops. So all of this information that you see here, we push a button to tell the computer to run it. Basically, we'll input data, and then the computer will run the actual numbers to calculate things like fuel. So really what I do as a dispatcher, and Rex, and I don't know, I know Adam said that somebody else also sat in with a dispatcher for a day or two. I know that some of you saw it, but anyways, basically we have a couple of buttons here that across the top of our screen. We'll click on a button, and it'll tell us how many passengers are booked for the flight, how much payload do we expect, and we close that down, and the computer will add that up and what that poundage is, and then we click on our next box, and it puts the weather. It gives us a weather package, basically tells us what the weather is for the entire route of the flight. We back out of that box really quick. Then there's a NOTAM box. And the computer just generates. Huh? Is Mom home? Sorry, hold on. Sorry, I'm at home today, so I've been taking care of the kids. Anyways, so this NOTAM package here, sorry, I'm kind of scrolling through things really fast. But we see all of these NOTAMs get put into the release, and we have to go through all of these NOTAMs and make sure that certain equipment or restrictions aren't being used. We don't really care about things like taxiways or obstructions. Those are things that pilots worry about, but we worry about things like this. This is like something that we see. We'll see runway closures like this. This is telling us that at Salt Lake City, one of the runways is closed from on the 24th, so today at 22:15 Zulu, which is our Zulu time is what we call universal time. So starting at the international date line, which runs through Greenwich, England, that's the universal time. So from where the 0 hour is, that's universal time. And we use that in aviation so that everybody's on the same page regardless of where we go. We don't have to calculate, well, we flew from this, we flew from San Francisco to Pensacola, Florida. That's a 3-hour time difference, the total length of flight. Like that just gets really, really, really confusing. And so we use the universal time because then everything's running off the same clock. So when we look at these NOTAMs and stuff, this time, this 22:15, it's, just to kind of give you a hint, in Salt Lake City, that's -6 right now. So so that's 10 p.m. Universal time minus the 6 hours, so that's 4 p.m. in Salt Lake. See how confusing that gets? But when you're at work, you kind of lose track of, local time, and you just use that universal time. So it's just telling us for that 1 hour from 22:15 Zulu to 23:15 Zulu, the runway's closed, so we can't plan to use that runway. So things like that, that's what we're looking for in these NOTAM packages. And the computer generates it automatically. We just have to make sure that we're reading the NOTAMs and that we understand what's going on. The TLR is all generated automatically by the computer once we've completed all the flight planning. It runs all the performance for us. The next box we look at is do we need an alternate? So we'll look at the weather. We'll look at these reports here, and we'll determine, do we need, if there was an emergency on takeoff and they got off the ground, where can we go that's close if there's, like, let's say an engine fails or an engine's on fire, we have a bird strike and it shuts down an engine. Things like that. If there's an emergency situation and we can't land at the airport we just took off from, then we need a takeoff alternate. So we'll look at this information. We'll determine, do I need somewhere other than the airport I'm taking off from to land if an emergency happens? Then we'll look at the weather for the destination airport, and we'll determine, do I need, or am I even legal to go? And if I'm legal to go, do I need an alternate? And we determine that by the parameters that the FAA's determined, and we'll go over that.
So do you always plan an alternate, or because for your examples like a bird strike, you can't plan for that? So do you always plan an alternate?
No. So when we're talking about things like a bird strike or something that we plan on happening during takeoff, the emergency procedure is to land as quickly as possible, right? So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll turn around and they'll actually land at the airport that they just took off from. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the only time that we're required to list a takeoff alternate is if the airport that we're taking off from is below landing minimums. So the weather is bad enough to where we can take off because, you know, believe it or not, pilots don't need to see anything that's going on. They just need to see that white line on the runway, and that's it, to take off. They need to, in fact, SkyWest policy is 600 feet. They have to have 600 feet of runway visibility in order to take off. Now, the landing minimums, let's talk about Salt Lake, for instance. The landing minimums is they have to have a 200-foot ceiling, so the cloud layer has to be at least 200 feet off the ground. And then they have to have a half mile of visibility. So that's a lot further than that 600 feet. So if we aren't hitting those weather requirements at our takeoff airport, we have to list an alternate airport. And that's the only time. Is it's like if there's an emergency, we cannot get back down on the ground at that close airport. So we plan somewhere for them to go that's safe to land at. So the emergency procedure is always to land somewhere as close and as practical as possible. You know, have any of you guys seen the movie Sully? Now, or heard of Captain Sullenberger and the Hudson River when he had the double engine fail because of a bird strike? Anyways, in the movie, you know, he talks about, well, I couldn't get back to LaGuardia and I couldn't go to the other airport. Now, weather and everything was just fine in LaGuardia, but he was too far out from the runway or from the airport. They were telling him, you know, you can either come back or you can go to this other airport. Air traffic controller was trying to direct him to a safe spot. But he was just like, I'm not going to make either. I'm going to hit a building if I try to go for an airport. The only safe place to put this down is in the river. And that's kind of what happened there. That's like worst case scenario. We never, ever, ever could plan for something like that. But we try to mitigate those problems as much as possible. You know, and kind of like the Southwest flight, they took off from LaGuardia Airport in New York, and the engine had the problem when they were, you know, fairly far from LaGuardia Airport, and so they diverted. We call that a diversion when they don't land at any planned airport. Or even if we do have an alternate and they decide that they're going to use the alternate, we call it a diversion. And so what they did was they diverted to Philadelphia Airport. We're, as a dispatcher, our job is just to make sure that we're giving the pilot, a lot of times when they decide that they need to divert and go to a safer airport, our job as a dispatcher, because at that point, it's directly affecting our job. Our job is to, we'll go over this in the FARs, but our job is to monitor the progress of each flight, issue any information regarding the safety of the flight. And the joint responsibility we have with the captain is the pre-flight planning, the dispatch release, and delay of the flight. So, you know, our sole job as a dispatcher, though, that monitor the progress of each flight and issue any information regarding the safety of the flight. That's directly on us. When they decide they need to go somewhere safer, we have to supply them information, as much information as we can, without completely overwhelming them about what airport do you want to use. Okay, let's go to this airport, or let's go to this airport. Here's all the weather information. This is the way they're landing. I've already sent, or I already had our controller call and get an ambulance on site and ready. So the second you touch down, or I have them with the fire trucks ready at the airport, that's our job, is to make sure all of that they need to be safe, as much as we possibly can plan for, is there waiting for them when there's an emergency. So we don't like emergencies. Emergencies are horrible, but we plan for emergencies because the best way to mitigate and reduce those amounts of problems that you have in those situations is to plan for them and make sure that you're operating safely. So,
how many dispatchers are there per flight? Is it just one person per flight or multiple?
Yeah, so at SkyWest, there's one person per flight. So now that doesn't mean that is the only flight on our desk. At SkyWest, we'll have upwards of 50 flights over a 10-hour shift, 50 to 55 flights on an average day. Some days we'll have a little bit less, but SkyWest is currently operating over 2,400 flights a day. We have a total of 94 dispatchers currently, so we each, do our part in taking care of those flights. Typically, airborne flights, we only will have maybe a total of, I think on my most busy days as far as aircraft in the air, I'll only have probably 10 to 12 aircraft, and that's when it's really, really busy. But the way they load the desks is they kind of start you out with a bigger amount and then taper it off closer to the end of your shift. And you actually plan your last flight about 2 hours before your shift actually ends. So that way they can at least get in the air. We try to have all of our airplanes in the air, and then we'll turn the responsibility, once they're in the air, we'll turn that responsibility over to the next dispatcher in line, and they'll do the flight following. So, Elizabeth asked a really good question about how responsible are dispatchers for the safety of the flight. It is a shared responsibility with the pilot in command. It is the dispatcher and the pilot in command solely that are responsible for the safety of the flight. And once again, this is something that we're going to really kind of talk about with FAR 121. Yeah, it is a direct responsibility that we share with the PIC. The first officer doesn't have that, the same amount of safety. The flight attendants, maintenance, they're responsible for the safety of making sure everything's correct. But as far as when the flight's actually operating, it is solely the dispatcher and the pilot in command that have responsibility over that aircraft. So that's why we have this course. That's why the FAA has mandated that we actually have this course, is because of how much responsibility we actually share with the PIC. Now, that being said, the pilot in command has, total authority, basically, as far as, making the actual decision for the flight. But our job is, once he's made the decision, is to support him and give him as much as we can to make sure that he's operating safely. Now, there's times that we disagree with our pilots, but we always communicate and talk about, hey, I know that you're requesting 1,500 pounds of extra fuel, but I think that's overkill. We have, we've planned for this. We've planned for this. We understand the situations that are going on here, and this is why I'm seeing that there's not a need for that. What do you feel? What are you seeing that's not the same as me? So we talk with our pilots, and we try to mitigate some of that back and forth, or we try to inform him and make sure that we're on the same page. But really, at the end of the day, the pilot in command is the one that's actually on the aircraft. So he has that final decision. But like I said before, we are directly, us and the pilot in commands, we're the only ones that are responsible for the safety of that flight. So it's it's a big responsibility, but yeah, it's also kind of part of the rewarding part of the job is that the knowledge that you directly affected that flight. There's times when there is just crazy weather or something happens to a flight, and knowing that you were directly involved in making sure that airplane got on the ground safely, it's very rewarding. I had a passenger with epileptic seizures just yesterday, actually, and knowing that I was helping and making sure that the pilot was talking about diversions. We were getting him in touch with doctors and nurses and making sure that this passenger was taken care of. Knowing that you're that directly involved with the day-to-day operations and the safety of each one of these flights is actually very rewarding to me. So that's kind of my spiel on the safety of the flight. Sorry, my wife tells me I talk too much, but let's take a quick. You guys want a 10-minute break? It's been about an hour now. Let's do a quick 10-minute break, and then we'll jump back on. All right. Is everybody back?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Okay. So let's kind of continue on. So a lot of the information will go back to this ECFR again. A lot of this information in the next two, if you look at your course outline here, you can see that today we're talking about this FAR 25, 61, and 71, and I kind of touched on this yesterday. These three and this FAR Part 1, that's the definitions and abbreviations that we went over. As far as these three, we're just kind of get the highlights out of them and go through them pretty quick here. There's really no reason to spend a whole lot of time in them. Like I said, when we talk about these different things, they're the FAR 25, 61, 70. Those are typically handled by another department. We need a general understanding, but it's not really required that we really have a good understanding of those different sections. So we're just going to kind of hit some of the highlights. So this 25, this FAR 25, this section, it just talks about our airworthiness standards. So this is where we're going to find, and this is the whole point of this, is that a lot of what we do as dispatchers, there's no way that we could retain all of this information. I know Adam talked about yesterday how when he took dispatch at Salt Lake Community College, it was a 2-year course. Well, that's the same as when I took it. It was 2 years, and the prerequisites before we could even talk about dispatch, we had to go through private pilot ground, we had to go through instrument ground, aircraft systems, human factors, all of these different courses before we could even look at the dispatch material, this stuff that we're showing you now. So even then, there's no way for you guys, for any dispatcher, to really retain 100% of the information and know exactly what every one of these FARs is going to say. So the important part is to know how to look it up if you have a question. And that's the same as when you're actually dispatching for a company. Like I said, I've been with SkyWest for 3 months now. I just went through all of my checkoffs to run my own desk and everything. I've kind of been a junior dispatcher for 3 months. Now I'm actually certified to run the full desk by myself. But when you're going through, we call them competency checks or comp checks. Even when you're going through that, where they're asking you questions about the systems of the aircraft, or, you know, they're talking about drift downs or FARs or legalities and things like that, there's no way you're going to be able to remember it all. And so even in those competency checks, you're still allowed to use the manuals. And the important thing that they'll tell you at any airline as well is exactly what I just told you guys. You just got to know where to look it up. So don't worry about writing any of this stuff down necessarily on these 3 chapters, other than knowing that CFR 14 CFR Part 25 that we're in right here talks about our airworthiness standards. So the main topics that they kind of talk about are these load distribution limits, weight limits, center of gravity limits, talking about ballast and stuff like this. And as you guys prepare for the ADX, there are actually a lot of the questions when it talks about the aircraft, and it'll ask you these pallet questions. You know, what is the weight limit of this pallet that's this dimension? And you have to determine the pallet weight, the pallet weight limit. You know, that's a question that ties into these subjects. And the need for you guys to actually know that, the only time you'll ever use that, regardless of where you're at, is for the ADX. And that's why we tell you guys, just memorize the questions to pass the test. Because there's no way you can retain all of that information. That's 2,000 questions, you know. So just memorize. Don't try to to think about it logically, because you just can't. And Adam, he talked about with his FAA training that he's gone through. There's actually some discussion going on about the difficulty of the ADX and whether or not there needs to be a revision and stuff like that. So talking about the difficulty and stuff like that, if you actually had to know all of the material in it. So like I said, a lot of our job is looking things up. And to be honest with you, I've never actually opened up, while at work, I've never opened up FAR 25. So just know that this is where we find those different subjects, like these load distribution limits. And you can come in here and read information about these different limits for the aircraft. So this tells you how they determine the maximum weights, the minimum weights, and things of that nature. So that's about all we're going to really go over with FAR 25. The other FAR that they have on, or that we have on here, is FAR Part 61. And once again, we aren't going to go into any really amount of depth. I know on the ADX they'll also ask a handful of questions out of this section of the FARs. A lot of those are going to be talking about, a lot of those questions are going to be alcohol. How many hours does a pilot have to rest after drinking a certain amount of alcohol? Well, there has to be at least 8 hours bottle to throttle, is what we say. So pilot, after any alcohol consumption, has to wait 8 hours before he can even sit in a cockpit and act as a crew member. So things like that, that's where you're going to find this information. What is required of the crew? Just make sure that that's what you guys write down. It talks about their logbook, their retesting after a failure of a test. A lot of this information we just don't really need to know. These medical certificates, I know there's several questions on the ADX about medical certification for pilots. Dispatch doesn't require a medical certificate, but pilots, there's certain time limits that they have to have that are used. Basically, the pilot has to have a full-blown first-class medical every 6 months and things like that. So that's where you'll find this information. Just the important thing is to write down 61. Talks about certification for pilots, flight instructors, and ground instructors. And that's the information you guys need to take away. If you guys have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free, to go through. If you have any questions that we can assist you with this stuff, this is exactly where we're going to go. And this is where we're going to have you come and, follow us into the FAR 61s, and we're gonna actually, the topics are really well laid out here, and we'll look for it and help you guys out with any of those questions that you guys have. So just know that this isn't something that we have to use very frequently, if at all. Now, crew support. Who are my crew support people again?
I used to be in crew support. Tyrell.
Mm-hmm. I know there's another person that is currently in crew support, I think.
Yeah, that's Donnie.
Yeah. So this is pretty much what you guys have to live and breathe for managing the pilots and the crews, correct?
Yeah, a lot of this, yeah.
So that's the other thing that, dispatchers, we have resources at our hands to help us with the burden of dispatching. We talk about the safety of the flight. The safety of the flight is the pilot in command and the dispatcher's responsibility, but we have this resource management that we can use and tap into to really help us do our jobs effectively. We get a pilot calling us up about crew rest periods and stuff like that. We say, let me get you over to crew support. They can answer any of those questions. So it really takes some of the weight off of our shoulders because, like I said before, do you think I could memorize all of this FAR? There's no way. It just goes on forever. 429 different paragraphs. So, that's why we utilize. You guys heard me refer to what we call a system controller or regional controller. What they do is they'll take care of dealing with what we call ops. So they'll, say there's a problem with an aircraft, we'll talk to the regional controller and we'll say, hey, this is the problem that I'm seeing on this aircraft. And the regional controller will be the one to call the station and say, hey, do you have a ground start or air start cart for this aircraft? Because, it's going to need that to restart its engines once they've shut them down at the gate. Things like that. We have that resource to help us. We have also what we call a customer service coordinator, and their job is to handle things like passengers. When we have these diversions, a lot of times there's one or two passengers that are like, can I just get off the airplane here? And the customer service coordinator is the one that takes care of that. Or say we have to deplane all the passengers because it's not going to be legal for a long time for us to fly into an airport, or an airport completely shuts down and we've got to put them up in a hotel. That's the customer service coordinator that actually will book the hotel and take care of that. So we have these resources at our hands, and it's not required that we know everything. We just need to know, like I said, where to find it or who to get them in touch with that kind of specializes in these different areas. So, does that make sense for everybody? So
Yes, it does.
So we'll move on to this part 71 here. So part 71 is our airspaces. So when we talk about airspaces, kind of what Rex was saying about airspaces yesterday. Let me pull up. Excuse me. This little diagram here just kind of shows us, Rex kind of talked about the limitations and what's required in certain airspaces. And, something I said was talking about basically depending on how much traffic is going through a certain area will also determine what class an airspace is. So this chart does a good job of actually showing us what some of those airspaces look like. Class B, we call it the upside down wedding cake. Because because that's pretty much what it looks like, is a 3-tiered wedding cake. Each one of these rings have a set mileage around the airport that we'll go and talk about. Then we have, Class C, Class D. Now, Class A airspace is everything from 18,000 feet to 60,000 feet. So this is where all of your, airlines operate. And a lot of your military aircraft and things like that. Some military aircraft go well above 60,000 feet, but this is where a lot of the traffic is going to lie, is in that Class A airspace. And so there's a lot more restrictions and things that are required for flying in that area. But as you can see, it's pretty intuitive how it's all set up. Class A is the most restrictive, then B, C, D, E, and G. The only thing that's not intuitive is they forgot the F, but I think that's because people don't like to say the phonetic term for F. When we're over the radio, we call it foxtrot. So they don't, maybe that was too many words or too much for them to say for an airspace. I don't know why there isn't a Class F airspace, but that's just the way things are. So, but yeah, you can just see how each one gets less restrictive. So,
Garrett, will you add the link to that specific image, please, to the chat?
Yeah,
Thanks.
I can throw it in there for you. Donnie, I just saw your comment. That's awesome. Yeah. I think that pilot probably just did not want to operate a flight. We have some pretty ridiculous times that we, were there. You can just tell when somebody doesn't want to fly that day because things happen. But kombucha, 3 sips of kombucha and she's out. It's pretty good. That's funny. Sorry, I'm gonna have to take that one to work. But anyways, yeah. So class, when we talk about airspace, this diagram will help you guys kind of understand the restrictions when we talk about them. You have to actually have certain certifications in order to fly in certain airspaces. So, and then the aircraft have to be equipped with certain instrumentation in order to fly in them as well. So, yeah. 71, just make sure you understand that that's about the airspaces. Now, I'm going to kind of skip over to another one. I don't think it's listed on here. No, it's not. But it's one that kind of going along with crew support. Another section that they use is 117, and that's the flight duty limitations and rest requirements for pilots. So talk about being fatigued and stuff like that. If a pilot ever says he's fatigued, he cannot, the second he says that over a public line or to a co-pilot or even to a flight attendant, once he says he is fatigued, he is pulled off the flight. We can no longer, it is mandatory that he goes home and gets a period of rest. And there's no corrective action we can even do at that point either. I mean, and our crew support people can probably tell a little bit more about that, but yeah, I mean, there's very strict rules on the amount of rest that pilots have to have, the maximum amount of time that they can be listed for duty time, and then the amount of rest that they have to have after they've completed so many hours of duty time is very strictly managed. Things like I can't even call a pilot. As soon as I use a company line to call a pilot, and if he's not listed for duty and I interrupt his rest period, then it restarts. He can say, "Oh, you ruined my rest period," even if it's 1 minute. You ruined my 8-hour rest period by calling me before I was on duty. I'm not fit for duty. Like, he could claim that, and there's nothing we can do to stop him from that. So having a basic understanding of these rest periods and stuff like that, not super important for us as dispatchers, other than knowing that we can't call them unless they're listed that they're actually on duty. That's really what's important. But crew support, this is another one of those worlds that they live in, is this 117. So let's see. And when you actually go ahead.
Do those restrictions also deal with dispatchers?
We do have a rest period, but it's not quite the same as a pilot. So we're going to go over part 65 here in just a second. I'm just kind of hitting the stuff that's peripheral to all of the important stuff that we want to talk about. But yeah, as dispatchers, there is a mandatory, like as far as scheduling us as dispatchers, they can only schedule us for 10 hours, and we have to have a certain amount of rest after each shift, where they can't schedule us. Things like that. That's all. We'll talk about that in just a second. But yeah, we do have those rest restrictions on us as well, but not quite as crazy as pilots and flight attendants. So. And then the only other one that I can really think of that just we don't really need to spend too much time on is this certification of air carriers. So this is, in order to be considered an air carrier and commercial air carrier, these are the restrictions and the things that they have to have. So so this is just kind of talking about like SkyWest. Let's use them as an example, and I'm going to use them as an example partly because of experience, and another part is because a lot of our curriculum is based off of SkyWest procedures, although we're not directly affiliated with them. So, but like SkyWest, this is the restrictions and this is the stuff that they have to abide by to keep their certificate as an air carrier. So that's what this section talks about. If you ever get really restless at night and need something to put you to sleep, just dive into these FARs and start reading them. You'll be out pretty quick. So, so I think we've covered a lot of the extra fluff. Just go over my notes real quick and make sure I hit all those.
I want to make sure that I hit all those too. So parts 25, 61, 117, 119, 65.
Yep. Exactly. And you know, the only ones that aren't listed on your course outline here are the 117 and 119 that we went over. Oh, we didn't hit 91 either. Oh wait, 91's right here. Sorry.
Okay.
Those are the only ones that 117 and 119 are the only ones that aren't on here. But I've kind of, you know, added on there because for this class, because it is something that you'll go over when you actually get assigned to an airline. You go through what's called ground school, and you go through all of these FARs. You know, they'll spend a week on FARs alone and legal to go and stuff like that, and then you'll go through their different procedures. You'll learn about the systems that are on the aircraft that they operate and things of that nature. So, you know, I try to give you a heads up of some of the sections that you might see in the future and some of the sections that may, you know, come up, whether it's studying for the ADX or things like that. So, yeah. Now let's talk about this part 65. Now, this is where we talk about dispatchers. This is all the nitty-gritty of what this course is and what we do as aircraft dispatchers. So we're going to go through this really quick, and if there's anything that you guys need to take notes on, once again, I will make that very clear. Please take notes on this. The other stuff, it's kind of like the other FARs. As long as you know where to find it, that's sufficient. But if I tell you guys, hey, this is something that you guys need to know, please make note of it. So the first thing that you guys need to know, FAR Part 65, Subpart C. You need to know FAR 65 Subpart C pertains directly to aircraft dispatchers. So we call it the dispatch FAR. So, so kind of what this is talking about is, you know, going through this certificate required. No person may act as an aircraft dispatcher, exercising responsibility with the pilot in command and the operational control of a flight in connection with any civil aircraft or in air commerce, unless the person has in his or her personal possession an aircraft dispatcher certificate issued under the subpart. So, so all that paragraph is saying is, hey, you have to have on your person, whenever you are dispatching a flight, you have to have your dispatch license. Now, you will be asked, you know, Adam Adam's job is the safety coordinator for the FAA over UPS Airlines dispatchers. One of the first things he'll ask the dispatchers that he's over and kind of audits is he'll walk up to them and he'll say, I need to see your dispatch license. And they have to, at that moment, it can't be in your car, can't be in your locker, it has to be on your persons. You have to pull out your dispatch license and hand it to them. So that is an FAR that is required. Kind of crazy, but, and you know, that's what the FAR says. Doesn't mean that that's how the person interprets it every time necessarily, but that is how it is stated. So now to get your license, there has to be some requirements met to be eligible. So the first thing that you need to know is that to even take the dispatch knowledge test, known as the ADX, you have to be at least 21 years old. So is there anybody in this class that is not 21? Nope, I didn't think so. Yep, that's the first requirement. Now, in order for you to actually get your certificate, you actually have to be 23. So like last class, we had a kid that was 22 years old. He passed all of his exams and completed the course, but he will not actually receive his certificate and cannot operate as a dispatcher until he is 23 years old. So when he's 23, we'll submit the paperwork and he'll actually get his license. So if you're not 23, just know that you're not the first one. We know how to take care of it, and the big concern is just to make sure that you complete the course, get all your tests done. Then at 23, everything's just submitted and you're a dispatcher for life. So the other requirement, and this is aviation-wide, whether you're a dispatcher, pilot, flight attendant, you are required to read, speak, write, and understand the English language. So English is the language of aviation. Aviation was born in this country by English-speaking Americans, and so we're the ones that decided that was the requirement. So the other things are you have to pass a knowledge test, known as the ADX, a practical test, and then you have to comply with this regulation. So the practical test, I don't know how much information Adam's given you. Like I said yesterday, we have what we call a DAID that administers the practical test. Adam or I are not allowed to actually administer the practical test to you guys, but we have somebody that's been designated and licensed by the FAA to administer those tests. And he actually works at SkyWest. His name's Greg Brooks. And he will actually come in, and kind of the way it happens is he gives you a flight plan and you complete a flight plan. It'll have different things that you kind of got to look out for that he wants to see, that you can demonstrate that you have a good general understanding of your role as a dispatcher. And then after you complete the flight plan, he'll go over several questions with you guys about general dispatch knowledge. And we call that section of the test the oral part of the test. So he'll actually go through and ask you questions like, what are the three sole responsibilities of a dispatcher? What are the three joint responsibilities between the dispatcher and the pilot in command, and things like that. And he just wants to see your understanding of your role as a dispatcher, and he wants to understand or know that you understand the basics of dispatching. So that's the practical part of the test. And the ADX, I think that's a dead horse that we keep beating. So, any questions on any of that?
How long is the test with the licensed person?
That test usually runs about 4 to 5 hours. So,
will it occur during class time?
We've had people like the first person. Sometimes we'll take it on the very last day of our 2 weeks. But other times we schedule it. We'll just schedule it with them. So if you have to travel for those last 2 weeks of class, those people that travel tend to have the priority because, they're either paying for a hotel or they're staying with some, family or whatever it is. They tend to have the priority over the schedule for the practical test, and we always worked it out to make sure that they have the practical done before they need to head back home. But then the rest of the students just kind of, just kind of schedule it. Greg can only administer 2 practical tests a day, so you won't be. Not all of you will be able to take it on the same day because of how in depth the test kind of is. Most of the time is just doing the flight plan. The amount of time it takes to complete a full flight plan can range anywhere from an hour and a half if it's a really short flight and you're really on top of your game to, some people have taken 4 or 5 hours to complete a flight plan. So, and he's not going to tell you, oh, you're taking too long or anything like that. So just know that, I'd plan on 4 to 5 hours for the test, and it tends to stay in that or a little less time. So, and we try to get those done as quickly as we can after the class. Adam and I have set up this course kind of in line with the SkyWest hiring dates. So there will be about a week break between when you guys complete the course and do, hopefully you will have the practical test done, to when the interviews will be held for SkyWest Airlines. So, like I said, we're not directly affiliated, but we have very close connections, and we try to provide as many opportunities as we can for our students. So, probably a lot better opportunities than you find in a lot of the other dispatch schools. Not to pat ourselves on the back, but but yeah. Any other questions on any of that first section? Really, the only thing that I want you guys to take away, and it's something that isn't extremely important, other than just know that you have to be 23 years of age to be a dispatcher, to actually have the license. So I think that's been removed from our test, our quiz, but yeah, that's just general knowledge. I hope you guys can kind of retain that. Not super important, but As far as knowledge requirements, so this is actually what you're tested on when you go through your practical test. You've got to demonstrate all of these areas. So we'll go over these really quick. So a person who applies for an aircraft dispatcher certificate must pass all knowledge tests pass a knowledge test on the following aeronautical knowledge areas. So applicable FARs, that's what we're talking about today. Meteorology, so that's a good portion of the oral part of the test is you'll talk to Greg about the weather, reading weather charts. What is icing? What is some of this upper air data? So we're talking about higher altitude weather data that we see. How do fronts work? How does the weather work? I'll just kind of show you some of the charts that we go through. So this is kind of what our map looks like at work. We can see basically the areas of precipitation, or whether it be snow, these blue areas, or where it's snowing, or severe snow, and these green areas where it's raining, basically, or a good chance of rain occurring. So the charts that we look at and use on a daily basis are going to be things like this. We call this an AirMet chart. I'll zoom in just a little bit for you guys. This chart will show us things like where they expect icing to be happening. So ice is really bad for airplanes. And we're going to get into this stuff, like I said. But ice will dramatically affect the ability for an aircraft to even fly. So turbulence, these are the areas in the country where they expect to see, whether it be near the surface or higher altitudes, these are the areas they expect to see turbulence. So, and nobody likes turbulence unless you're a little kid. Get into that mountain wave turbulence, and it's kind of like a roller coaster. My daughter laughs every time we get into those. And then these are the areas where they're expecting like low visibility. As far as low visibility, we tend to call it marginal VFR or IFR. So IFR just means instrument flight rules. It means that the pilots typically aren't looking outside the airplane to see what's going on, to locate where they're at. When we talk about IFR weather, we're talking about weather that basically prohibits that. Flying through clouds or having obscured ground, they can't see the ground. Things like that. That's normal day-to-day operations for pilots. Most of the time that they're flying the aircraft, they aren't really spending a lot of time looking outside the airplane for any visual references. So but what this chart's for is, and what it's telling us is, airports that are under these areas, we can expect to see limiting lower visibility. So these are the areas that we could possibly have alternate requirements, or even not be legal to go. So we look at this chart, and then we actually look at what's being reported at these airports in these areas, because these charts are just giving us a real basic idea of things that could be occurring. Like it said, it's a forecast. So forecast just means this is a weatherman's best guess on what's possibly going to happen throughout a day. SIGMETs are like areas of severe weather, whether that be heavy rain, thunderstorms. Thunderstorms we put those in what we call a convective SIGMET, which we'll look at here. But SIGMETs are severe turbulence, things like that will negatively affect the performance of the aircraft or could limit us in some way. Weather phenomenon that could limit us. These convective SIGMETs, when we talk about convective weather is weather that is rising. These clouds. A thunderstorm, when you look at what we call an anvil top cloud or a cumulonimbus, towering cumulonimbus cloud, those clouds that are just extremely tall and kind of look like an anvil, those are convective. That's convective weather. It means the air is rising really rapidly in those areas. So when we talk about convective thunderstorms, or when we talk about thunderstorms, we want to be extremely careful flying through those areas, because the amount of and how rapidly the air is rising in those areas can really do a lot of damage to the aircraft if they're not careful. So, when we talk about those towering cumulonimbus clouds, there's actually restrictions for pilots. We're not allowed to fly within 20 miles of a towering cumulonimbus cloud. Things like that, because of how much damage they can do to an aircraft. So that weather's pretty hazardous. So then this is what probably most of you are familiar with seeing on the news at night. They talk about highs and low pressures. Well, when we talk about weather, we talk about what's significant about a high pressure system and what's significant about a low pressure system. Where can we expect to see weather occurring? Things of that nature. What are the general characteristics of these high pressures or the low pressures or these frontal systems? What does this symbol here mean? Things like that. That's information that we go over, and we want you guys. We're really, we use on a daily basis as dispatchers. So another thing that we use are these TCF alerts. So these TCFs are where we're expecting like really severe weather to occur. More than just a convective SIGMET. These TCFs are meaning we tend to, if we see these, we will route planes around them because of the amount of severe weather that's usually contained in that area. So that's what these TCFs are for. Another chart that we look at a lot. This is called a winds aloft or wind forecast. This tells us a lot about what are the winds doing, what direction the winds are going, and this even tells us how fast they're going. This tells us our temperature at this altitude that we select, so we can select any of these altitudes, kind of see what's going on with the winds in those areas. So that's all in the meteorology section. Just giving you guys a little taste of what we're going to talk about there. These charts are so fun. This is the old school charts. This is really zoomed in.
Garrett, was it just me, or did anybody else not see that last winds aloft chart?
I can go back to that. That's no problem. So this winds aloft chart. Let me zoom back in here. Let's see, maybe even make it a little bit bigger. There. Is that showing up now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so this winds aloft chart, like I was saying, it'll even show us like where the jet stream is. We can see these areas of higher speed winds. As we select these different altitudes, a lot of our flights are going to be more in this altitude range. You can see that the winds change and do different things. You can also see where the jet stream is at those altitudes. So it looks like the jet stream kind of comes down from this area and then comes up. And a part of it actually kind of branches off and comes to this Gulf area. So kind of branches over the central United States here. So, but yeah, we learned to interpret this data and how it affects our flights. So. We can see temperatures, humidity. This is all humidity right here. Areas of high humidity and low humidity. Utah is always in this kind of, always kind of looks like this. Nice and yellow. 23% humidity down in St. George. Get all chapped down there. Then you have these areas that go to Virginia and it feels, you can take a shower and then dry yourself off and get ready, and as soon as you step outside, you feel like you're back inside the shower, but this time you have all your clothes on, and when we talk about humidity with aviation, does anybody remember where that precipitation was that we looked at? It was all kind of in this area. So we're going to learn about humidity and what the humidity and temperature dew point spread does to weather, the amount of water in the air as well, how that kind of affects the weather. The more humidity, the more moisture in the air, the saturation levels, that's going to dictate kind of what weather we see. So, trying to think of any other real charts that you guys might see. We can always also use these radars. These radars will kind of show us, it's just like that map that I showed you at first. It will also tell us, there's hail occurring in this. This meso means something. These numbers mean something about, the tops of the clouds or how fast they're moving and in what direction the weather is moving. The satellite images, these satellite images will show us the echo, basically. So satellite sends down a beam, and this is the reflection, basically, that it gets. So they also have this infrared, so they'll use different light spectrums to pick up these clouds. So this is what the visible spectrum is. As you can see, this is kind of like the the nighttime, the day-night shading. So you won't see any visible clouds in this area because it's too dark. But where there's still sun up, you can see the actual clouds that the satellite can see. So kind of interesting stuff. We also use the textual formats a lot. These flight plan guidances will also tell us information to help us better plan our flights. So, does anybody have any questions about any of that? I mean, there's probably thousands of them, but I'm trying to keep it as general as we can and try to stay on topic, but I don't know, I like to kind of break away from the boring reading the dictionary as much as I can and show you guys kind of the practical part of it, practical application. So, we kind of talked about this NOTAMs. You guys will be required, like I said before, to know what a NOTAM's saying, what affects us as a dispatcher, and when we're looking at NOTAMs, what are we looking for? Are we looking for runway outages? We're looking for, if there's an ILS out, what does that do to the airport? What does that do to the aircraft in the air? So NOTAM, once again, acronym, stands for Notice to Airmen. So interpretation of weather charts, maps, forecasts, sequence reports, abbreviations, and symbols. All stuff that we looked at and we'll talk about when we talk about meteorology. Talk about the National Weather Service and its functions. This is all kind of covered in meteorology when we're talking about weather. Principles of air navigation under IFR, so Instrument Meteorological Conditions, so we call this IMC, and the National Aerospace System. So how do the pilots navigate through this weather? How do they know what's going on, where they're at in the sky? We'll talk about that a little bit. We need to know a little bit about the air traffic control procedures. A lot of our job, we're dealing directly with air traffic control as far as, what's going on. What airports are overloaded right now and can't handle any more aircraft. When weather really slows down, how many airplanes they can get into an airport at a certain given time. What does air traffic control do in those situations? So aircraft loading, weight and balance, that's all flight planning stuff. Aerodynamics, so talking about an airplane. So since we're on this topic, I just wanted to, there's some of you that said that your aviation knowledge this is the first you've ever talked airplanes. So I wanted to give you guys a quick introduction to an aircraft. So those of you that aren't really familiar with aviation, have you guys ever flown on a commercial airliner or flown in an airplane at all?
Yes, I have. I've flown on numerous airplanes. I just don't know much about them.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about systems and stuff at a later date, but I just kind of wanted to give you guys a basic introduction to the airplane. So, and kind of some of the things that we're going to talk about and I'm going to use on a frequent basis. I wanted to make sure that you guys understand. So with an airplane, everybody knows where the cockpit is. The fuselage, this is where all the passengers sit. This is also where all the bags are loaded. They're going to be loaded somewhere in the fuselage. So if I use the term fuselage, you now know what that is. Turbine engines, that's just a jet engine is what the general public calls them. It's just our propulsion. So, or thrust. Wings, you guys know what a wing is. So these are our wings, but then we also have this tail section back here. This isn't, in aviation, we don't really call this a tail. We call it a vertical and horizontal stabilizer. The other correct term for this section of the aircraft, where it actually forms the tail, we call this the empennage. So what that consists of is, like I said before, the horizontal stabilizer. So this is the flat surface. This is this V shape. And then we have what we call the vertical stabilizer. So we'll talk about the control surfaces on each one of these different things real quick. So the primary flight controls that affect the flight, this is the kind of the axis. You know, when we're walking or driving here on the ground, we operate in a two-dimensional world, basically. I mean, it's three-dimensional, of course, but when we're driving on the roads, that is very two-dimensional unless we roll our car. Then all of a sudden it's three-dimensional. But aircraft, we live and breathe and everything in a three-dimensional environment. So when we rotate on this pitch axis, we call it the vertical axis or axis. The pitch, that's when the nose or the tail go up or down. So when we climb or dive, that's our pitch. The flight controls that operate that pitch are going to be back here on this horizontal stabilizer. We call those an elevator. So the elevator controls our pitch, the up and down. Now when we talk about this roll axis, this is our lateral. Okay. So this is the roll. So when we waggle our wings or when we initiate a turn, we start with a roll. And that roll is induced by this flight control we call an aileron. And they're on you'll have inboard and outboard ailerons. You also have the flaps. These flaps here, we're going to talk about later. They're not they're not part of that primary control system. So, and then we talk about the yaw axis, and that's on our horizontal plane. So this is what cars do, is they yaw. So the flight control surface and what we call that is again back here on this tail. This is a rudder. So our rudder will control our yaw, our horizontal stabilizer on there, the elevator, that's controlling our pitch, and then the aileron will control the roll or bank of the aircraft. So that's kind of a quick, down and dirty introduction to an airplane. So Those are your primary flight controls: aileron, elevators, and your rudder. Those are primary flight controls that you'll see on every single airplane you ever look at.
Will we ever have to identify this in a test?
Not in a test, no. So I just want everybody to have an understanding. So as far as systems go, though, you'll have to know, what control surfaces do we consider primary, what flight controls do we consider secondary. So we'll ask you to list the primary flight controls, and then we'll ask you to list a couple of the secondary. But that's kind of the extent of this diagram, really, and and these flight controls. So I'm just trying to give you guys an introduction to an airplane, The other things that you can kind of see on here that it talks about, these spoilers. The spoilers and the flaps and the slats. So we use this to control the airplane at slower speeds. So flaps, pretty much every airplane is going to have flaps. 99.9% of them are going to have what we call flaps. Now what the flaps do is they increase the angle of the wing, and they help the airplane generate more lift, but also with that lift, it generates drag, so it let me pull this up really quick. So let's see if I can. Anyways, this is really the gist of it, whether it's a jet or whatever. So you got lift, weight, thrust, and drag. So what happens is these flaps, think about, like, if you guys ever rolled down the windows in your car and stuck your hand out, and when you have your hand flat, like opposing the wind, so your hand's vertical, the wind just want to rip your hands back. But as you like straighten your hands out and go straight vertical or horizontal, sorry, I'm trying to catch up on the texts. I'll answer some of those in just a sec. So when you change the angle of your hand, you guys can feel the difference of how much drag that creates. Well, the flaps, think of that as putting your hands, kind of cupping them and vertical, making them go vertical. How much drag that creates and how much that pulls your hands back. That is what a flap's doing, is it's creating that extra lift, but also slowing the airplane down, because when we're coming in on approach to land, we want the airplane to operate slower and but still have as much lift as we can. So that's what the flaps are doing. Going back to this image, the slats here on the leading edge of the wing here, those will actually, they operate similar to a flap, but what they do is they drop off the front, so they'll actually come down, not in front of the engine, but they'll just kind of drop down on the front of the wing, and they operate in unison with the flaps. So like I said, again, it's just changing the angle of that wing. And just for you guys that are wondering if I'll post these on the Google Drive, I can most definitely do that. I'll post a link to these images. I'll post a link. I'll just keep all of these up, and then I'll just create a Word document on the Google Drive so you guys can go back and look at these pictures if you want. Once again, these aren't really 100% necessary. I'm just kind of giving you a quick down and dirty of an airplane here. So let's look at a wing really quick. So a wing just isn't flat. If you guys ever, oops. If you ever look at a wing,
man, I haven't seen that web page in years.
What one?
Wings, the U.S. Airways non-rev site.
Oh, I didn't even know what that was. Yeah. Didn't, what company was it? United that bought U.S. Airways?
U.S. Airways bought American.
Oh, okay, but they operate under the American.
Yeah, they have a longer name recognition than U.S. Airways.
Yeah. So, this is a little more in depth. We'll just use this stuff. So this is kind of what the shape of a wing looks like. It's a little more like beefier and thick at the leading edge and gets, tapers out and then slims down almost to, a really flat surface at the end, the trailing edge of the wing, so the back of the wing. So this image here, let's see if I can blow this image up just a little bit. Let's see if that didn't mess up the image. Kind of looks funny. That doesn't look right. There we go. Much better. Well, here's an actual wing. Okay, that's a good way to talk about it. So, anyways, what happens is there's a guy named Bernoulli a long time ago that found out some principles that we use in flight. So he was looking at what happens when we restrict certain areas, in a vacuum. What happens, and to the air flowing through that. And he kind of figured out some of these principles that our aviation principles are founded on. What he found is that the wing going over the top of the, or I mean the air going over the top of the wing is moving quicker than the wing flowing under, or the wind flowing underneath the bottom surface of the wing. It accelerates over the top of the wing, and it is slower over the underside of the wing. And what that does is it creates less pressure on the top surface of the wing and more pressure on the bottom of the wing. So it basically pushes the airplane up. And we see this in buoyancy on ships and things of that nature, but it's the same principle that we see with a wing. There's less pressure on top of the wing and more pressure on the bottom, so the air is basically pushing the airplane up into the air. And that's how these wings work. They're not just like a flat piece of metal, you know. There's actually a very particular design to each one of these wings depending on the aircraft. And so what the flaps do is they'll actually drop off the back side here, and they come down on an angle from this trailing edge of the wing. And doing that, once again, is it is just slowing down the wind under this wing even more and accelerating the wind over the top of the wing, which is increasing that lift capability. Now slats come off the front edge, this leading edge of the wing, and do virtually the same thing that the flap does. It's just increasing that wing shape even more. So that's what the flaps and slats are for. Let's see if I can just kind of save that for you guys too. So yeah, that's the basic principles of a wing. Let's go back right here. So now we know what the flaps and the slats do. The spoilers just create even more drag. So, you know, we want the wings, you know, there's times where you really got to slow down fast. These spoilers just disrupt the wind coming over the wing. And show you what they do. So these are the spoilers. Let's see. Oh, so basically what happens is when those panels come up, the wind just gets disrupted coming over the top of the wing and just kind of spills off. So it reduces the amount of lift that the wing's generating to slow us down. It just creates more drag on the airplane. So, but here you get a really good view of what the flaps look like, and then the spoilers on top of the wing. Does that kind of freak you out, seeing that the wing isn't like a solid piece? Here's the ailerons out here, but here's your flaps.
To be fair, no part of an airplane is just one big solid piece.
Yeah. What freaks people out even more is when they're flying on an airplane and they see those wings bending and flexing. And that's all part of the design. It's what it's meant to do. In fact, if you look at the new 787 with its wings, you can actually see, so when you look at them, Let's see if there's a picture of one on the ground. So you can see this guy's on the ground. He's still moving. So the wings, you know, they kind of create this V shape. But look at when they're generating lift, they get even more. As you can see here, there's even more load, and they can actually create a pretty dramatic, those wings can flex a pretty insane amount. And it's all part of the design. If they were extremely rigid, they'd just snap off as soon as you hit a bump, bump of turbulence. So oh, there's a good picture there. So here's neutral, and then it'll flex a total of 26 feet under its max load. That's pretty crazy. Anyways, I could talk about and look at pictures of airplanes all day, so sorry about that.
Is that a control feature, or does it just do it in response to, I don't know how to phrase it. Does it just do it, or is it a feature that the pilots have the ability to control?
No, it actually just does it. So the wings are completely carbon fiber, and they've redesigned basically how they build the wing. They found that when they make it out of a more flexible material like carbon fiber rather than, you know, sheet metal and metal spars and stuff, and when they allow the wings to flex like that, they actually get better performance and they're more fuel efficient. And so it's just natural that the wings flex that much. And depending, like I showed you on that picture, is depending on how much load they have, the higher the wings will flex. They also find that that wing flex also allows for really a smoother ride, really. I mean, it's not like turbulence doesn't affect it as much, because turbulence affects all aircraft. But the amount of wing flex, think about it as kind of like a shocks on a vehicle. You know, I have a 3/4 ton Yukon, GMC Yukon, and when I'm in that vehicle all by myself and I hit a bump, it's like sitting on a jackhammer. You know, it just rattles you because of how stiff the suspension is. But when you're sitting in like a Cadillac and you go over the same bump, you know, like you can't even feel it. And that's because the shocks are made to design or designed to absorb that bump. Well, it's the same with like a wing design. When they get hit, when you're sitting in an airplane and you're looking at the wings and you can see them flexing, that's affecting the amount of turbulence that's felt throughout the entire aircraft. With the 787 and that wing flex and everything, it's actually almost acts kind of like a shock absorber. Now, it's not like an extreme amount, but like I said before, it really affects the fuel economy of the aircraft. And it also just kind of, one of the side effects is you get a little bit smoother and nicer of a ride on a 787. So kind of interesting. new technology. But yeah, that wing flex is really good. If it was just completely rigid, like I said, you'd hit a bump and those wings would come sailing off. So
It's 8 o'clock. Should we take a quick break?
yeah, let's go for it. Thanks for reminding me. Do you guys, has everybody eaten dinner? Do you guys need a 20-minute just to eat some dinner?
I'd like to stretch my legs a little.
All right. Let's do 20 minutes. Let's get back on at 8:20, and we'll try to wrap up this part 65 here. So.
Sounds good. See you back in a bit.
All right. All right. Is everybody back?
Yes.
I'm here.
So, just gonna check real quick and just see if anybody has any questions that they thought of during the break or anything that they feel we need or might want to go over really quick. All right. So, how does everybody feel about their intro to airplanes? Does everybody feel a little more comfortable with the airplane, or anybody have any questions about aircraft in general? All right. So, let's see. We've kind of gone over all of this stuff. So we talk just a couple more things that they test you on, and the practical. Talk about aerodynamics, abnormal flight regimes, human factors, aeronautical decision making. So he's going to test, some of the choices that you make. Just kind of get a feel if you guys are, looking in and thinking about everything that you need to think about when you're dispatching. And then crew resource management, and we kind of touched on that just a little bit yesterday, talking about and earlier today about some of the resources we have as dispatchers to help us do our job and be more effective. So as far as experience or training requirements, so this is what you guys are doing now. This is, this is what's going on right now. So there's a couple ways to get a dispatch license. The important thing to take away from this section is that you're completing one of those things as you train in this class. Some of the other ways to get a dispatch license are things like if you were in the military and you were a pilot, flight navigator, or meteorologist, then you qualify for an aircraft dispatch license. So automatically, you just have to go and take the practical and the ADX and show that you are sufficient in your knowledge of dispatch, basically, and you could walk away with a dispatch license. Other ways that you can get your dispatch license would be things like if you're a pilot, flight engineer, meteorologist, if you're operating as an assistant dispatcher. Those are also ways to basically bypass the school training. But since just assuming that none of you guys have that background or experience, that's why we're here in this course. So at the end here, the way that we can demonstrate that we're proficient in the areas that it talks about here is by taking this course. And that's covered right here. Statement of graduation issued or revalidated in accordance with that section we just talked about, demonstrating those basic knowledge requirements. And you've successfully completed a dispatcher course. So, that's basically where this training comes into play.
Is there a reason there's no subpart 58? I'm just curious.
Why it skips?
Yeah.
It's probably amended to where they felt like it was no longer relevant and just basically struck from the record. I don't know. Adam might have a little more in-depth knowledge since he actually works for the FAA now, but that's my best guess. So for skill requirements, basically nothing to take away from that area, other than that you're proficient. And really what it's saying is you're going to be, when you are given the practical test, you're going to be tested on. The requirements are is that you have a basic understanding of a large aircraft used by a certain air carrier, and that it has to fall under that knowledge category we already went through. So this is where it talks about the hours requirement that we kind of touched on yesterday. So this minimum of 200 hours of instruction. So, we've got to go over all those parts that we talked about. We have to provide you with a minimum of 200 hours of instruction, whether that be through watching video or in-class discussion or lecture or, after class. If you guys have questions and need help with certain things, any of that time, that just all kind of counts. And we don't necessarily keep track of that other than we do take attendance, and we just make sure that, you guys are at least getting the instruction that you need. Just to kind of make sure, but if you guys are watching the videos of the class at home and keeping us up to date on how that's going, all of that counts. Does that make sense? So that's the gist of this content and minimum hours. So then this just kind of goes over the paperwork that gets issued. some of the requirements for us to operate as a school. So here's one that we can gladly say we're in business still. At least 80% of our graduates from the Aircraft Dispatch Academy complete the practical test on the first attempt. And like Adam said, 100% of our students pass the practical test that attempt it. So just know you're in good hands. Adam's got a lot of experience. I've got, even though, you guys are technically my second dispatch course that I've taught. I've got several years of training and instruction that I've done in different aspects of work. So, you guys are in good hands as far as that goes. And we're not going to leave you guys hanging. Like I said before, we literally put our dispatch license and the ability to operate as a school on the line every time that we sign you guys off for a practical test. So, if we feel like you don't adequately understand the material, we're not going to sign you off to take the test. And that's, just the way it works. But everybody that's requested to take the practical has been signed off. And like I said before, we do have a great success rate. So just letting you guys know that there's actually a requirement, an FAA requirement for that. So let's see. It's kind of interesting that it gets blurry here for some reason. I don't know what's going on. This kind of talks about some of the training facilities. The personnel, each applicant for the dispatch certification course must meet the personal following requirements. So just kind of, the requirements for me to be able to teach this course or Adam. Each applicant must have adequate personnel, including one instructor that holds an actual dispatch certificate. Glad to say we both hold dispatch certificates. And we may have somebody step in 1 or 2 days throughout the course, know that they are also certified and able to instruct as well. Just kind of backup instructors. The other requirement is that we can't exceed 25 students, and that pretty much sums that up. We also have to keep records of your guys' quizzes and stuff like that. That's just something that Adam and I keep track of. We do require 5 flight plans be completed before we sign you off for our practical. That's something that we work with you guys directly with and make sure that you guys have an adequate understanding of the flight planning before we send you to actually test. In this class, we're really trying to increase the amount of time that we spend on that flight planning. So,
Garrett, are our quiz and flight plans records available to us so that we can see what our progress looks like?
Yeah. Each one of you will have a personal Google Drive as well that will have each one of your quizzes with the score and everything. So we give you all of the actual documentation as well, just so that it's on your record, so you guys, know what's going on as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem. So the last part of this is the information that is required. Adam talked about, some of this stuff we are literally just required to actually talk about. At least mention and talk to you guys about at some point in this course. And we have to actually include all of this. And as you can see, it is quite the list. So, yeah, kind of going through that. If you guys all have access to this document, it's on the Google Drive, and as well as it's in that ecfr.gov. You can look up this FAR Title 14, Part 65, Subpart C section, and you can look at this Appendix A and see everything that you guys need to know about. So that being said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time reading everything that we're going to go over. Just know that at one point in time, we have a game plan and a lesson plan in place to actually talk about all of this. Now, does that mean that we're going to spend a ton of time on some of this information? No. Some of it is going to be just a general brief kind of description, like I was talking about up here. 25, 61, 71, 91, 117, 119. Those are all, it's not necessary that we go and read the entire document because it doesn't necessarily pertain to us as dispatchers on a daily basis, but it is something that we may be, as far as monitoring and informing the pilot and issuing any pertinent safety information, it is our responsibility to have a basic understanding of those general chapters per se. So, so that's just a good example of some of the stuff that we're going to give you a general information so that you guys know where to find it. And then we're going to spend more time and allocate more time to the stuff that's more important that you guys actually have a grasp on. So, as you can see, this meteorology section is probably a good majority of the things that they required. It's 2.5 pages of things that you guys got to learn. So when we talk about meteorology, that's like we said before, that's going to take up probably a good 2. Oh, thank you, Ash. Sorry. Once again, it's really hard for me to pick up this chat window constantly, so I catch up every couple of minutes. Yeah. As far as meteorology goes, we spend a lot of time in that because that is kind of the bread and butter of what we do as dispatchers. We're meteorologists. Navigation we'll go through several different types of navigation. We'll talk about satellite navigation. We'll talk about ground-based navigation. Aviation, for the first 100 years of aviation, we used, well, almost the first 100 years of aviation, we used strictly ground-based navigation. And that's using, in the early days, it literally started out with people going out into the middle of the desert and making cement arrows, gigantic arrows in the dirt, and then building a light tower on one side of the arrow, to help. And it literally pointed pilots in the right direction. Pretty crazy, but they exist.
There are actually several of them here in the St. George area.
Yeah, there are. You can hike to them and see the remnants of these cement arrows that were used for early navigation in aviation. In fact, I can pull up one of the ones in St. George real quick. Right here. So this is overlooking, this is looking down. I think this is the one that's just above Washington. I think that's the Washington area. But yeah, like you can see here, this is just a cement arrow in the dirt. And on this little pad here, they'd actually build a little tower and put a rotating light on top of it. That's what they would use for navigation. I wonder if you can see it here. This picture. I'm not seeing it. It's there somewhere. I wonder if it's up here. But yeah, I mean, you can even see in this picture, you can see the pylons that the light tower was stuck to. So that's your early ground-based navigation. Now, ground-based navigation looks something like this. This is what we call a VOR. We have different types of VORs. But basically what this does is it's an antenna that sends out a 360-degree signal and actually gives what we call a radial off of this to tell the pilots where they are in reference to that point on the ground. You can see here, this is a VOR radial in course. So the station there sends out this 360-degree radial, as we were saying before. I clicked when I shouldn't have.
Hey, Garrett, what does VOR stand for?
Oh man, it's one of
Very
those.
high.
Yeah.
Very high omnidirectional radar.
Yeah, there you go. It's one of those things that you know until somebody asks you, and then all of a sudden it falls off the edge of your mind.
The only thing I remembered from my training.
Sure, it's not the only thing, but yeah. So this VOR sends out this 360-degree, basically compass. So it also sends out a signal that if you're listening on your radar, or I mean on your radio, you can hear, and you're tuned into this VOR, it'll send out an actual Morse code identifying what station you're tuned into on your radio. So it'll send out a Morse code, dots and dashes, and that's how you can identify it. But then the pilot has an instrument inside the cockpit where he can actually see, once he's tuned into that radio frequency, he can see what radial he is on in reference to this station. So this DME on this side here, this stands for distance measuring equipment, but what that does is it not only will this VOR send out that 360 degree radial or compass in layman's term, it also sends out a signal telling the airplane how far away from that station it is. So that's how pilots, up until just recently, and we still use them all the time, but that was the primary way of navigating until satellite came along. Now with satellite navigation, we use what we call, we've got GPS, we've got GNSS, we've got RMP procedures, we've got RNAV procedures. And all of those, what those do is basically, it's just that, a satellite rather than a ground station. I mean, think about some of the things that can interfere with a ground station as far as being able to receive signal from these stations. These stations can only transmit at a certain distance from them. Another thing that can cause problems for these, different ground-based navigational aids are things like mountains. I've noticed a lot of times when I've been flying up in the cockpit between St. George and Salt Lake, we can't pick up the signal for the approach into Salt Lake Airport until we've cleared the point of the mountain. And then all of a sudden it'll kick on. When technically we should be able to receive it clear back over Provo or, back way far away. We should be able to pretty much tractor beam right into the runway with that signal. But because of things that obscure the signal, like mountains and even tall buildings and stuff like that, the signal isn't very clear, and sometimes there can be interference. But with satellite navigation, it can provide a much more precise location, and all it requires is, 4 or 6 satellites be overhead at any given point in time. Well, think about how big the sky is. The signal can penetrate any clouds or any weather. It just opens up the window to a much more clear and much more precise form of navigation. So that's why everything's starting to slowly move over to satellite, is because it's becoming more and more reliable and it's more accurate. Does that make sense? But anyways, getting back over to this fun stuff. Navigation, we'll go over how all those systems work. So then we have a section on aircraft systems. So like I said before, we use the CRJ 700 aircraft in this class. We go over the systems that they have on board that aircraft. And we'll talk about things like the different sources of power, AC or DC electrical current. We go over the hydraulic systems, the pneumatic systems, the flight controls, and stuff like that. Omnidirectional range, there you go. I gotta see this link that Ash. Oh, there you go. Yep, there's even a tower. This one's saying, this is, kind of like when you're pulling into the gate. Guy's crossing his batons to tell you to put the brake on. That must have been early form of a gate.
I was just trying to lighten the mood a little bit.
No, I appreciate it. This is the kind of stuff that I like. I like breaking out of the dictionary.
Good work, Dash.
But yeah, we'll talk about the CRJ 700 just so you guys can kind of see what a CRJ 700 looks like. Let's pull one up real quick. I'll show you guys what they look like. So this is in fact, there you go, SkyWest. This is also a SkyWest airplane right here. Yeah, the CRJ 700. So kind of a little quick history on the CRJ 700. The CRJ 700 is a Canadair regional jet. That's what the CRJ stands for. And what they did was they took a private jet called the Challenger. As you can see, there's a lot of similarities between the two. They just took a Challenger jet, cut it about right there, and put a big old, cut it just forward of the wings, and then put a big old tube in there, added onto the fuselage, made the wings a little bit longer, and then put a little more powerful engine in there. And that's what a CRJ is. So, should feel pretty luxurious, I guess, when you're riding in a private jet that, I mean, that's the birthplace of the CRJ. So, but yeah, it's a pretty neat aircraft. This is what the cockpit of the aircraft looks like. You have the pilot in command, the PIC, on this left side. We also call him the captain. And then we have the second in command, or the first officer is what we also call them, in the right-hand seat here. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. But it's a pretty neat jet, and we'll go over, when we talk about systems, we'll go over what these displays, the information on these displays. We'll go over what this little thing here is called. This is what we call an FMS, flight management system. Then this is the engine start, APU, all this stuff. We'll talk about it and go over what it is and what it does. Yeah, this is the fun stuff. I love talking about this stuff. But yeah. As far as communications, we also talk about, these NOTAMs. We talk about aeronautical publications, abnormal procedures, things like that. Talk about air traffic control, their responsibilities, some of the techniques that they use to to make sure that airplanes are spaced out appropriately, and that everything runs smoothly in and out of, whether it be an airport, even on the ground when we're talking about, terminal environment and talking about actually at the gates, making sure that's when they pick you up, is before you even push back from the gate. You're already talking to air traffic control, and they're making sure that everything goes smoothly from pushback to taxi into the gate. So we'll talk about how they keep everything straight and sorted out. I'll show you guys this picture really quick too. This is what is it called? Oh, Flight Watch. So there you go. There's all the airplanes that are in the sky right now over the United States. And this is only the airplanes that are, pretty much talking to air traffic control. This is, you may have a couple helicopters in here, a couple hundred helicopters in here. You can see what kind of a mess the LA area gets into, San Francisco.
Is that scaring anybody else? Because it's scaring the shit out of me right now.
And that's to put it light.
I'm not even gonna lie. It's like, yeah, that's not okay.
The good news is you're only tracking 10 of those.
Yep.
Oh, good God, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Okay, that's all for me.
You can install this app, FlightAware, on your phone, and it will show you what planes are directly over your head at any given minute.
I don't think I want to know right now.
And remember, something to kind of help you realize really the scale of this map. What jet has the wingspan that large? So this is like blown up huge in your face, and it just looks like a giant mess. It's not really that crowded. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's definitely crowded, but it's not. When you zoom in and get real close and actually see how many airplanes are maybe over.
Well, yeah, there are definitely more cars on the 405 in LA right now, for sure. You're right.
But
it's a little intimidating because I feel like I'm getting fed from a fire hose right now. So
yeah, and you know what? That's kind of how it's going to be for the next 8 weeks, and I'm not going to sugarcoat that. You definitely get overwhelmed at times. But.
And not for nothing, I didn't get to intro last night, but I am the one with the most senior aviation experience in the class right now, and so for me to be a little bit intimidated.
Yeah.
Not for nothing, you guys. It's okay.
Thanks, Zach. I quit.
But yeah, just think
it's okay for you guys to look at that and say, "Oh shit."
I kind of see it as a privilege and an honor to be someone who gets to interact with this level of complexity every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, there's huge job satisfaction in what we do on a daily basis. But think about 9/11. That's what air traffic control across the United States had to get on the ground, and they got it on the ground in less than 2 hours.
My sister and family were driving from Salt Lake to San Francisco that day because of the National Ground Stop, and to know that there were no aircraft in the sky and to drive for 14 hours with not a single aircraft overhead was the freakiest experience I've ever had.
Yeah, it's almost
It was
surreal, you know?
Yeah, it really was.
You know, that's the only life we've really known is having those contrails up in the sky and seeing airplanes.
This really is. It's a lot of fun using this application, especially at night. Summertime, I'll sit out, in the backyard, and several planes will go over, and you just know that one just from FlightAware. That one's on its way to London, that one's on its way to New York City or whatever.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
And the software that we use at SkyWest, we call it Fusion. It looks a lot like this. I mean, it's not near, like, we can filter out all the junk that we don't want to see, but it's a lot like this, to where we can see our airplanes. We know what ones are associated with our desk. We can even turn it on so it's a mess like this if we want to. I don't know why you'd want to, but
you're actually able to see planes on the ground as well, are you not?
Yeah, if they have the ADS or what is it, ASDX? Yeah, ASDX radar at the airport, we can see them on the ground, and we can see all ground movement and identify our aircraft. And that's very helpful too, because I can literally watch my airplane come in and touch down, and then I see the system, give me what we call an on time. When the second the wheels touch the ground, the ACAR sends a message up to the satellite, and then sends a message down to me in my office and says, "Hey, the airplane's touched down on the ground." And I can literally watch that happen as it's happening. So it's really, really neat stuff. So, but yeah, if you guys ever want, you can jump on this app, and you can, like they're saying, you can actually go into these different airplanes if you're unfamiliar with this app, and you can actually see what type of aircraft. So looking at this is KAL Airlines. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure who that is. Flight 271. It's a Boeing 747-800. He's at 35,000 feet, cruising at 589 knots. And his flight's from Anchorage to Chicago O'Hare. So
I want to say that's Korean Airlines, but that makes no sense.
Yeah, going from Anchorage.
Going from Anchorage, but Cal is Korean Airlines. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that is interesting.
It's a connecting flight or a continuing flight from Korea.
Yeah, it could be.
It very well could be. That's funny.
Oh, there you go. Oh, no, that's the flight I just clicked on. That's kind of cool, too, is you can actually see where the flight came from, their route of flight, what they were planned on. So you can see this green line, I want to say, is the one that they were planned on taking. The blue dashed line is the actual route that the plane actually took. So, oh, no, I had that backwards. Green line's the one, the flown route, and then the blue dashed is the planned route that they are taking. And you guys can see, all you flat earthers out there, and I know there's some somewhere in this country. If this was a flat earth, why would we take such weird lines country to country? Just don't understand it. Technically, if it was a flat earth, wouldn't it be faster to fly direct, but instead we take these kind of roundabout, arced flight paths. I don't know, just some food for thought. There you go. Anyways, kind of fun stuff. And I'll, like all of these links, I'll post in the Google Drive for you guys. So, but the other thing is these emergency and abnormal procedures. So, what do we do in an emergency? How do we handle those situations? Who do we talk to? Practical applications. This is basically the last 2 weeks of the course. Is putting all of it together. So that's basically what we're going to really focus this time on. That last 2 weeks on is this practical application. Now, some of you guys have seen, and I didn't mean to put it on there, but maybe I'll just let you guys take a look at them. Talking about practical applications. I've got like a couple dozen of these that I've already created. I haven't put them all onto the Google Drive yet, but these are some of the most important things that you guys are going to need to study in this course once we start talking about practical application. Is this legal to go worksheets? I'm just going to leave them on here. You guys can look at them. But just know we're not really going to spend too much time talking about them until we get a little closer to that, the last part of the class. But, this is using the TAF, determining are we legal to even dispatch a flight. So we'll go over how to work these sheets. I just wanted to kind of point that out. If you guys were wondering why they were there. But going back to this practical application parts, that's one of the biggest things that we're going to really try to drill into your guys' heads is, are we even legal to dispatch? Do we need an alternate? And if we do need an alternate, what are our landing minimums at that airport? So that's really, if dispatchers break an FAA regulation. So if there's something that we do wrong at our job, that tends to be probably the number one thing is either not listing an alternate when it was required or, something of that nature. But it's pretty serious, seriously affecting the safety of the flight, could potentially affect the safety of the flight if we're not making sure that it's a safe place for the airplane to land, So that's something that we're going to spend a lot of time on. And you guys will hopefully get a lot of practice on. But you guys can start looking at those if you want. But just know that it's not something that we're really going to start hitting hard until later in the course. But that pretty much finishes off part 65 for us. I don't really want to get into part 121 tonight because of how in-depth and how much information there is in 121. So that being said, is there anything you guys want to talk about or discuss? Any fun stuff that you guys want to even talk about or discuss? I know that Michelle talked to me about possibly coming and job shadowing. We're open to that. We can set that up. So if that's something you guys would be interested in doing, and you're in the St. George area or visiting the St. George area, let us know, and we'd be happy to set that up. Do you guys have any questions? Concerns?
Just general confusion on my end. I'm good.
I didn't have any concerns until Ash said something, so
What concerns or?
about being overwhelmed by that map with all the planes on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, just I can't remember who said it, but just remember only 10 of those are going to be your airplanes. So that should
Jeff
bring
has-
it ease.
Jeff had a question, Garrett.
Okay, yeah. So, Jeff, that's a really good question as far as flight releases, generating them. On a really good, perfect 10 and clear day at both the departure and destination airports, where the weather's just gravy, don't have any real NOTAMs, taking out, some of those ground-based approaches or anything like that, you're going to be able to generate a flight plan in anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes per flight plan. That being said, there are days when, to put it blunt, it is pure hell as far as generating a flight plan because of the situation that's going on. There's days where we actually have to reroute. We have routes. We actually have somebody called an air traffic control system coordinator, and his job is to, generate routes. He'll take a city pair that we're planning on flying to, and he'll create a couple routes, flight plans for us to use that we can just click on the flight plan that we want to use and call it good. And there's some days where those routes have weather that is bad. We kind of showed you those TCF and convective SIGMETs. Well, sometimes that prevents us from flying through a specific area, and we have to kind of route around those areas. And so when we route around those areas, we actually have to, figure out, how do we get around it? There's times where equipment fails on the aircraft, like the FMS, that system that I pointed out in the cockpit view. Let's see. Yeah. This down here, these two, computers right here. The FMS is what our GPS is tied to. And what it does is it's managing all of our flight systems. So, if the FMS gets deferred to where the FMS isn't working, like that screen won't come on, they can't use satellite navigation. They have to use strictly ground-based approaches or ground-based navigation. And when that's done, we have to plan our flights completely different. And so when you have weather and then systems go down and stuff like that, it can create quite a large amount of work for you to do on a single release, and it could take 20 to 30 minutes to generate a single release at that point. But just know that there are, 30, 40, 50 dispatchers in that room at any given time that are there to help you out. Some people may not have the same issues because of where their flights are scheduled for that hour, and they're willing to take on additional flights to help you out because they know that you're dealing with problems like that. So, on the light end, it could take 5 minutes. On the heavy end, it could take somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes.
I think another thing to be mindful of, Garrett, that those who are coming in from another industry may not realize, and obviously the January 22nd class, I think, would have been the most optimal, but coming in right now where class might start toward the end of summer, they're going to deal with, if they decide to go with SkyWest and are hired on, they're going to deal with some fall operations that are going to be more optimal. Again, with the lighter flight load, like you were talking about, where you're not going to be bombarded, you're not going to have 30 flights a day on your shift. You're going to have a lighter flight load, and you're going to kind of be eased into the shallow end of the pool. And it's going to be an end of summer to fall flight load versus full-on winter operations that you're dealing with, to kind of get you familiarized with the winter operation before you actually dive into the deep end of the pool. And so I think that's something also that you guys should be mindful of. The company doesn't want to set you guys up to fail. That's one of the great things about SkyWest, if that's the opportunity that you guys decide to pursue, is that they want to definitely set you up for success, because your success means their success. And so that's something to be mindful of.
Yeah, and when I say the days of pure hell, they are very, very few and far between. Weather is dynamic and changes rapidly. So, and as you guys can probably piece together, weather is our number one obstacle when dealing with flight planning. And that's why we spend so much time on it. But like Ash said, SkyWest is very good if that is the route you decide to pursue. SkyWest is industry-wide known for their training. We are the gold standard of training, as somebody put it yesterday. Really, I think that was Elizabeth that said that, but we are very well known industry-wide between majors and regionals for having some of the best training. So know that SkyWest does give you the tools to be successful. And like Ash said, they're not going to throw you into the deep end of the pool. When you get out of training, the first day that you're on a desk, over a 10-hour period, you're working directly hand in hand. The trainer is literally sitting right next to you, looking over your shoulder, talking you through each one of the flight plans, and making sure that you're hitting all the points. And between the training that we provide here at the Aircraft Dispatch Academy and the training that you get at SkyWest, that ground school is 3 weeks long. Between those two, the training, all that training you receive, you will hit the floor very knowledgeable and have a very good understanding before you even see your first flight of what you need to do. So know that, like Ash said, you're not just going to get thrown into the deep end of the pool. Now, as far as the stress level goes, there are days when you just, you are so bored because of how perfect the day is. You kind of get to that point where you're like, come on, something happened so I can, do something a little more non-monotonous. But then there's days where you are just overloaded with work and it could be a super stressful day. But you know, I worked at L3. I worked in manufacturing for 6 years. I was in the Navy. As far as stress level goes, it's just like the days that I worked in manufacturing. I did project management stuff. You know, there were days that were just pure hell for me. I was working directly with the government, making military equipment and repairing military equipment. And there were days just as stressful at L3 as there are at SkyWest. And then there's days that were just as easy and gravy, you know. Something I've come to realize.
I mean, I think there's always going to be things, you know. San Francisco has flow, Chicago has fog. You know, there are things that are going to happen. Denver's got tornado watch and snowstorms on top of that. You know, so there are going to be things that are going to happen throughout the course of a regular season, but it ebbs and flows. And so I think that that's something that you guys need to take into consideration. And so when I said overall, I'd say a 6. I'd say some days stress is a 10. Some days stress is a 1. But overall, I'd say a 6 just on an average, because most days you're going to be, like Garrett said, waiting for something to happen because everything is a walk in the park. And other days you're going to have flights that have something going on in the Midwest and other flights that are just a walk in the park. And it's going to ebb and flow just like anything else in any other job.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm trying to relate it to is my previous job. You know, it just happens. And I've come to realize that really in any work environment, work is work. You're going to have days that are great and days that suck. And I really don't feel like dispatch is the exception to that rule or more heavily weighted on one side or the other. You know, but just know that on the dispatch floor in the OCC, the Operations Control Center, we are very good at working with each other. All of us have seen there is always going to be somebody that has seen a situation that you are going through. They're going to have empathy and sympathy for you, and they are going to help you out in any way, shape, or form that they can. The other thing that's great about the SkyWest is even external things that happen in your life in general. SkyWest is very accommodating and very, very good to deal with in just day-to-day life even. They are very good to their employees and take very good care of their employees. And Ash can probably attest to that as well as anybody else that's worked for SkyWest.
And Rex just asked that on chat, and that's probably a really good segue for my intro, which I didn't get to do yesterday.
It was a personal question, actually.
What's that?
I say it was a personal chat to you, but that's fine.
Oh, okay. And I'm happy to kind of let everybody know what my status is. I've been with the company for 18 years. And I'm grateful to be with the company still today. They're incredible, and they've stuck by me through thick and through thin. They've given me as much as I've given them. I started in 2000 in crew support and worked my way through crew support for 5 years. I started out as a crew scheduler and crew support supervisor. Before moving over to IT, I was with the IT service desk, and I was the manager of IT system support and applications for about 10 years. And had some very huge personal challenges for the last couple of years and took some time off in at the beginning of 2017 before coming back to work in an HR capacity, and very grateful to have that role. Worked on some special projects for HR. I'm currently in the drug and alcohol compliance team, and looking to start fresh with a dispatch license and see kind of where that takes me. So it's been quite the journey for me. And like Garrett was saying, whether it's personal or professional goals, the company is there to stand behind you 110%. And I can attest to that in every way, shape, and form. So
yeah, I've noticed that even, my wife's grandfather died while I was in the middle of training, and every job that I've worked prior to this job, when I'm in training, those first 3 months, when they say that there's nothing that they can do as far as my schedule goes, they stick to it. And, I would have missed my wife's grandfather's funeral, but I brought it up and just said, hey, is there anything that they can do? And they said, well, we can't give you the paid bereavement, but we will give you bereavement time off. And then we will also work with your schedule to make up those days that you missed and help you through the whole situation. That's just the way it is. They will do anything to take care of you, whether it's personal or professional. My brother is a dispatcher as well. He just barely, his wife's grandfather passed away just last week as well. Through our flight benefits. My brother listed what we call S1A priority. Not only did he get paid for 4 days off, he had to travel all the way to Philadelphia, and Delta flew him. Basically, he bumped everybody on the airplane with the exception of a Delta executive flying into Philadelphia for the funeral. So just perks and benefits that you don't really think about outside of the company, but when you need them, most companies won't even give you the time of day. SkyWest is very, very much so about employee well-being, and taking care of the people that work for them. So, I'm sure we'll talk about it several other times during the class, but
I have to say that I can back up everything that's being said because my wife's been with the company for coming up on 22 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's great. I mean, they're very good.
And I have to say, Rex, I love your wife. She's freaking awesome.
Well, that makes two of us. I just don't want anybody else saying that on here.
But yeah, if you guys can think of any more questions, we'll reconvene class again tomorrow. I don't want to take you guys past that 9:30 hour, but appreciate everybody jumping on tonight. Feel free to text me or Adam with any questions. And if it's something that you can think of between classes and you just text me or an Adam, and it's something that we can bring up in class as well, we'd be happy to do it. Or if you guys have anything that you just want general information about, we will help you out. So that being said, I'll get all this onto the Google Drive, and you guys have a good night.
Thanks, Garrett. You too.